Welcome back to Miley Media. This is part 2 of the story I Am a Forester, and I encountered something I can't explain in an old growth forest. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, there'll be a link at the end of this video. Enjoy. The day I had been dreading finally came. After months of denied reports, quiet but heated arguments behind my boss's closed door, and the most intense procrastination ever known to man, the company sent me back to the old growth. You have to believe that I fought it. In the end, the protests were useless. I would have quit this job if I could have, but I have bills to pay. Fees to keep my parents cared for in their old age. There was nowhere to hide. The neon orange marker paint that I had discovered sprayed into an X upon my chest had washed away easily enough, but it had left behind an angry red rash of scaly skin and scarlet warmth. The doctor told me that it was likely an allergic reaction to a chemical in the propellant aerosol can, or a component of the paint itself. The itching rash had faded over time, but never fully disappeared, the faintest ghost of the mark that haunted me just barely visible to those who cared to look close enough. I had completed 1 or 2 assignments since the experience I had previously recounted for y'all. Working in Pennsylvania and around D.C. to mark up and measure tiny stands of trees just outside the bustling suburban corridors. Even in those minuscule groves of adolescent trees and shrubs, the green glow of the canopy sent shivers down my spine and bile rising to my throat. I was a wreck, nearly in every sense of the word, and I don't think anyone who believed me could blame me. The problem was that no one actually did believe me. Not truly. The email from the company heads came on March 2nd, 2020. When I saw it in my inbox, I had sat silently staring in my cubicle for agonizing minutes, before finally resigning myself to cold acceptance. I scanned the details with defeat. Return to parcel. Monongahela National Forest. Work imperative. Multi-million-dollar stake. Depart immediately. Fuck. The rest of that morning is just a foggy blur, dragging myself through my duties in preparation to return to the place where I had encountered something I could not explain. Something I could not forget. It must have been just before noon when Piper and I were roaring down the interstate towards that dreaded grove. Acres of black woods and hidden things. God, I shouldn't have gone. I have no recollection of the 4-hour drive into the depths of West Virginia. The next thing I knew, I was standing next to my truck, engine clicking and popping as it cooled and settled. With my heavy bag slung over my shoulders, ahead of me loomed the narrow trailhead that led to the forest the world forgotten. With a shuddering breath, I steeled myself and stepped into the woods. The sensation was so strange. My mind was caught in a vicious wrestling match between feelings of mortal terror and comfort of coming home. I absent-mindedly pawed at the faded mark under my shirt as I tramped along the winding and overgrown path. Thoughts churned and chained with my aching skull. The things I had seen here, half remembered and half unforgettable. The splendor of the unspoiled forest around me. Grinning, lipless teeth. The endless awe of the old growth. I walked in a daze, like man towards the gallows, or perhaps towards a holy reliquary. By the time I walked around the old sycamore tree, just a few scant bones left lashed to its branches. I had regained my senses. The sights and sound of the woods returned to me as I made towards my old campsite. I wiped the watery stuff running from my nose. It was cold out here. Only the first buds of the year starting to appear on the branches of the trees. This was about the time I began cursing myself for coming back here, but it was way too late now. Suddenly I stepped out into the tiny clearing in which I had once made camp. On the far end of the break in the woods waited the boundary of the old growth, looming in ancient trees cast in the shade of dark, dead leaves that still clung to their soaring branches, in stark refusal to let sunlight desecrate the floor of the grove. Even in the latest days of winter, the earliest days of spring, shadow ruled the old growth waiting ahead. As I started, a chill wind whispered from between the tree trunks, stinging my face and whipping through my hair. A grim thought crawled through my mind. Yeah, hello to you too. Pulling my gaze from the dark boundary ahead of me, I surveyed the small clearing. The shredded remnants of my old tent stood in half-hearted defiance of gravity, poles bent and broken in angles better suited to modern art. Slowly pulling open the door flap of the mostly collapsed tent, I saw that all the original contents were missing. My sleeping bag and the backpack I had carried out here previously were nowhere to be seen. I let the tent flap fall limply back. There was no salvaging the nylon heap. Just as Randy, the local who had accosted me last time I was here, had said, the tents you find here are always empty. I turned back to check the fire pit less than a dozen feet behind me. The stones were still here, but not as I had left them. The rounded forest stones, now covered in crawling moss and flaked lichen, were stacked in a perfect tower that came to a stomach height. One on top of the other, they were balanced immaculately. The slightest breeze should have been enough to upset the delicate cairn of stones, but they did not fall. Atop the tower of stones, untouched by vegetation, age, or weather, was my pocket knife. Dropped in the shock of my previous encounter here, with a spiteful sniff, I snatched the knife and gave the stones a small kick, letting the tower crumble into a disparate pile. I made camp in the clearing over the next hour or so. Pitching my new tent and reconstructing the fire ring, I unfurled a large ball of twine that I had brought with me, attaching aluminum cans to it as I laid a tripwire perimeter around my little oasis. Setting an alarm like this would likely do little to help me should something go wrong during my stay here, but it eased my worry just the same. As night fell, I sat by my fire, listening to the silence of the forest that I knew all too well. I awoke in my tent in the early morning rays of the sunlight to a tiny buzzing of my watch, letting me know it was time to work. I went through my morning routine. I had my breakfast, I threw my backpack on, stepped over my tripwire, and marched as stoically as I could across the clearing towards the waiting old growth. As I quietly stepped across the mossy floor of the darkened grove, I noticed one thing. My work was gone. All of my bright orange X's I had marked upon the trees that were to be harvested had disappeared like mist in the wind. That paint was designed to last as long as logging projects may drag on, sometimes years, and I had sprayed it barely 6 months ago, and now it was all gone. The bark of the trees, barren of paint, and gnarled and blackened by hundreds of years, mocked me. Gritting my teeth, I began to work. I worked for hours that day in the chilly March weather, the ancient forest around me silent beyond the sounds of my work. Measuring, mapping, marking, I went through my tasks quickly and robotically, never once shaking the undeniable sensation of cold eyes on my back. Maybe my fear made me more perceptive, or maybe the forest and what waited within it simply chose to show me more than it had before. Whatever the case, I saw things. Rare sights that punctuated the hours within the stand. Animal bones lashed to and dangling from branches that towered over the muddy ground. A bright yellow hunter's cap, soaked with water and stuffed into a gap between boulders. The rusted lower frame and wheels of an old-fashioned baby carriage. A tangled pile of twine and aluminum cans, new and untouched by age or weather. There was less than an hour of daylight left as I finished up my first day at work. I rounded the thick trunk of a massive honey locust, stinging odor of marking paint still wafting from the fresh X I had marked there. Beyond the old tree was a steep forest pothole, perhaps a sinkhole that had collapsed thousands of years ago. It dropped barely 5 feet down and maybe 10 feet across. Drawn by some strange human curiosity, I peered over the edge. The sides of the shallow pit were choked with thick roots and sheets of moss, creating a coiled mass of wet vegetation that snaked downwards. Dangling into the murky 1.5 feet of rainwater and snowmelt that collected at the bottom of the wide hole, the smell of stagnant water and something far worse rose up to meet my nose, causing me to recoil and gag at the stench. My mouth went dry and a shiver ran down my spine as I gazed upon what floated in the pit below. Fur matted with oozing mud and rotting mold clung to the bloated meat which split at joints and folds under the pressure of corpse gas. Skin flensed away from the limbs and extremities revealed the darkened and spongy remnants of an exposed bone, soaked through with the stinking and stagnant water that filled the pool. A single clouded and milky white eye stared up at me from the face turned aside, suspended in clear sludge that clotted in the sockets of a skull barely held together by rotten ribbons of tendons and cartilage. The horrid carcass had at one point been a large dog, perhaps a German shepherd, judging from the scattered patches of fur that remained. Strapped across the dog's hollow and collapsing rib cage was an old backpack that I had left behind the first time I came here. The sharp sound of a snapping twig came from behind me and I whirled to face the noise, sudden shock gripping my racing heart. A man stood there. I recognized Randy Davidson a split second before he spoke. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. The remnants of the rash on my chest throbbed dully. "It's you again. What the hell you doing back out here?" His question was subtly cut short as a massive pale shape lunged from the growing shadows around us. The hulking white thing moved soundlessly as it slammed Randy into the muddy ground. He let out a pained gasp as the air was knocked from his lungs. With inhuman speed, it whipped around to face me, and blood ran cold as I laid eyes on its all too familiar lipless grin and greasy flesh. The stench of rotting moss wafted over me. Pale orbs rolled and twitched in their membrane-covered sockets as the horror stuck at me. A single triple-jointed arm lashing out and bashing into my chest. The thing hit with such strength of a feral beast, bolts of pain shooting through my chest as I felt my sternum pop. The lightning-flash blow sent me skidding and stumbling backwards, the sensation of weightlessness overtaking me as I tumbled down into the pit at my back. I was still attempting to suck in air as response to the creature's painful strike when I hit the water. Stinking liquid rushing in my mouth and throat as I had landed directly onto the carcass of the dog, the floating mess of rotten meat and fur already but dissolved as I passed through it. Particles of the decomposing animal stuck to my teeth as I thrashed in the murk. I lurched upwards out of the shallow pool, alternately gasping for air and vomiting bile and rainwater corrupted by rot. Blood laced with adrenaline roared in my ears. I could hear the sounds of desperate struggle above. Crashing branches and splattering mud accompanied by Randy's screams of pain and terror. I scabbed at the slick moss and roots around me, desperately attempting to haul myself the short distance out of this stinking pit. Slipping on wet vegetation and collapsing mud, I managed to drag my head and shoulders above the lip of the old sinkhole. I saw Randy struggling against the pale thing that stalked the old growth. Pinned to the ground, with its drooling mouth open and long hooked nose mere inches from his face. He clenched his fists and kicked his legs impotently as it pressed him down into the damp forest floor. I watched on in horror as the thing craned its neck downwards with an almost serpentine sway, joints creaking in its spine as it did so. It parted its long blunted teeth and a tongue emerged. For a split second, the tar-black tongue hovered, dripping thick ropes of phlegmy drool before lashing down Randy's throat. His intensifying screams were muffled as the horror leaned in, embracing him in this foul, lipless perversion of a passionate lover's kiss. They held their struggling for long agonizing seconds as I hauled myself fully out of the pit. It then craned backwards, turning its horrid face to meet my terrified stare. Its worm-like tongue snaked back into its gullet as Randy gasped for breath under its grip. Its teeth clenched in a disgusting mockery of a grin, glistening bands of vicious spittle still bridging the gap between it and the victim's mouth. I sat sprawled on all fours at the edge of the pit as it released Andy. I seen its monstrous size as it rose to its full towering height. Joints and tendons creaked within its gaunt and jaundiced body as it took slow and purposeful steps towards my prone form. A deep, croaking click slowly emanating from the depths of its throat as it reached towards me with filthy black fingernails. With a sudden jerk, I was yanked violently to my feet and dragged to the side. It was Randy, coughing with exertion as he pulled me by my shirt collar. "Come on and run," he gasped, not letting go of me as he began sprinting into the woods that surrounded us. I pumped my legs to keep up, the speed of the terror propelling me. We dove through the old growth, ancient trees seeming to twist around us in the growing darkness. Mud clotted our boots and threatened to pull us to the ground with every step we took. I followed Randy, hoping to God he had a destination and was not simply running into the woods in a panic. Looking over my shoulder, I couldn't see the thing following us, but I could hear it somewhere in the gloom as it laughed and called, noises like the hellish fusion of a squealing pig and cackling lunatic. I don't know how long we fled into the deepening night. The sun had disappeared completely by the time we stopped. Panting for breath and nervously eyeing the woods around us, Randy keeled over with his hands on his knees, gave a short grunt, and waved a finger past me. I turned to check what he was pointing at and saw a dark shape looming out of the darkness, the squat and blocky bulk of a lightless cabin. I helped Randy towards the structure as he fumbled around in his pockets, producing a jangling and heavily laden keyring. He seemed sluggish, as if the run had taken a steep toll on his body. We crossed the creaking porch with haste. The cabin was a plain thing of log timbers, beaten and drained by weather and age until they were gray. I stared grimly at the old wooden door, which bore a crude and obviously recent carving of an X. Randy shoved an old-fashioned iron key into the lock and shoved open the door. Hurrying inside, I followed. Randy fumbled ahead of me in the darkness, rattling objects which I could not see. I heard the telltale rasping of a lighter, following by the flash of the flint. After excruciating seconds, the flickering glow of a tiny fire sent dancing illumination to weakly fill the space around us. The cabin was tiny, one room maybe 15 feet on each side, a small cast-iron stove, choked beyond the useful thick layers of rust, with an old pile of firewood at its side, stood at my right. Directly ahead was a square table on which rested an eclectic gathering of woodworking tools and dining utensils in haphazard stacks, as well as the flickering candle that Randy had lit. 2 stools waited tucked underneath the table's lip. At the back of the room was a simple bed, sheets stretched across, and its lumpy mattress almost entirely eaten by moths and mice. Small glass-paned windows glinted in the candlelight. Everything was drenched in dust, and the smell of mildew obviously untouched for years. Randy lurched past me, slamming the door shut and ramming the deadbolt closed. As he moved close to me, I could smell foul sweat dripping from his pores. "Help me lock these shutters," he grunted. I moved to oblige him, pulling the heavy wooden shutters over the small windows and looping the hook locks closed. He talked quietly as he worked to close the windows on the other side of the cabin. "Great-grandpa's hunting cabin. Came out here once or twice when I was a kid with my old man to check on the property after Grandpa sold it off. Lucky I even remembered where it was." I glanced over my shoulder as I moved to the final window on my side of the room. "Randy, what the hell is that thing?" "Your guess as good as mine. I ain't never seen anything like that before in my life." I heard him take a shaky breath. "My granddad used to say something wasn't right in these woods. Would tell us things. My old man would tell him off for spinning ghost stories." "Christ. Well, what do we have to do? Fuck me. I should have never come back here." The hinges creaked as I forced the shutters up against the window. "Yeah, maybe you shouldn't have." Randy trailed off as he struggled with his own window behind me. "Randy?" I probed as the silence began to grow. As I turned to see the cause of the quiet, a foul sound and a stench assaulted my senses. A wet, rumbling expulsion of gas and vicious splattering upon the ground and the burning odor of sickness, sulfur, and shit brought stinging tears to my eyes. "Jesus Christ, Randy, are you fucking kidding me?" The angry words caught in my throat as I whirled around to face them. Randy stood facing me, shivering in place. His face, gaunt and pale, streamed with sweat and tears, which ran and pooled in the deep wrinkles of his skin. Dark circles, the deep purple and old bruise had formed under his eyes, which stared blankly ahead. Pooling with liquid, and glassy like those of a dead animal, his nose and lips dribbled with spit and mucus. Foul sludge ran from his pant leg to pool around his boots. It was as black as tar and watery, with clots of solids, the color and consistency of old boiled coffee grounds. The smell was unbelievably horrid. Randy parted clammy lips and whispered a quiet, "Well, damn," before collapsing to the ground in a pool of his own sickness, sliding down the old wall timbers to lay sprawled against the cabin wall. Gagging and fighting back panic, I rushed to his side. He rolled his head weakly to face me. The drool dripping from his lips began to run as black as the stuff that gathered underneath him. "Oh my God, Randy, what's happening?" I took his sweat-drenched hand in my own. "Granddad got sick like this. Came back from the woods one night. Came back like this." Randy let out a slow, gurgling cough. "God, nobody knew what happened. He didn't even make it through the night. We all watched. I'm in his bed screaming that it had rotted his insides, that it had got him. Nobody knew what he was talking about. Lord help me." His breath was feverishly hot on my face and smelled of compost and spoiled meat. As he spoke, the boards of the cabin front porch let out a painful creak. Randy let out an agonized moan as a fresh spew of black foulness joined the pool below him. Oh God, please." Spittle as dark as pitch ran freely from his mouth now. He stared with begging eyes towards me. "Please kill me." The X-shaped rash on my chest felt as if it were on fire. Slow, taunting scratching rattled along the door. With his free hand, Randy groped at my side. His face was a shattering mosaic of pain and strenuous effort, drenched in the sweat of sickness. With a weak grunt, he brought his hand up. Clutched in his pale and shaking fingers was my pocket knife, the one my dad had given me a long time ago. He pressed the folded blade into my hand. Please, please, don't let me die like my grandpa did. Kill me, he softly begged. The door at my back groaned as slow, even pressure was applied. Randy's sorrowful and cloudy eyes stared at me as I unfolded the tiny knife, with a small sliver of glinting metal shining in the candlelight. My chest was a stinging matrix of pain. I held my breath as I stared into the little impotent blade in my hand. Then back to Randy. There was a sharp pop and clatter as the deadbolt snapped and fell to the floor behind me. Please! As the cabin door crept open with a dreadful creak, I ran my pocket knife across Randy's throat. A gush of blood, blackened and corrupted by sickness and rot, splashed over my hands and lap. It was nearly unbearably hot, burning with fever heat. He gasped and gurgled through a shredded windpipe for a painful final moment before falling silent and further slumping soundlessly into the mess beneath him. The stench of decay poured from his body. I kneeled there sobbing as the floorboards behind me creaked and shifted with heavy weight. A throaty click emanated from directly above my head. I closed my eyes. A weighty hand came to rest atop my skull, inhumanly long fingers stroking my face. I sat immobile as creaking joints moved above me, more deep chittering, the sound of wet dragging and a hefty thump. The hand left my head. The wet sounds and creaking floorboards retreated towards the door, and then were replaced by crackling of something dragged across the forest floor deeper in the old growth. I sat in the cabins, eyes screwed tightly shut, drenched in the stench of rot, and knees soaking in blood and filth, until weak rays of sunlight warmed my back through the open doorway. I opened my aching eyelids. Randy was gone. His corpse pulled away, leaving behind a black trail of coagulated gore and shit which disappeared out into the woods. My pocket knife lay in front of me, tiny blade stained and sticky. I left it there as I rose to my shaking feet. Mindlessly, I wandered the old growth. I trudged like a dead man, unfeeling and unthinking. I must have stumbled in circles around the forest for hours, filthy pant legs sticking to my skin with every step. In the end, I found myself staring at my truck, my old faithful Piper. Through blurry eyes, on a stark white pane of her hood, smeared in rotten black gore, was a huge Forester's X. A squealing cackle echoed somewhere in the distance. Where the filthy lines crossed in the center of the hood rested my pocket knife, clean and folded. The world has all but forgotten the old growth, but I never will. Alright guys, that's the end of part 2, and you're probably feeling how I am, which is wanting some more. This is just a brilliant story, and I love narrating it, and if there is a part 3, I will be uploading that as well. Make sure you guys check out part 1. There will be a link in the description or at the end of part 1. Make sure you check it out. Comment, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.